would like to introduce our second speaker in this session, Andre Joseph-Witzig, who is a technical advisor for Grenada land actors in Grenada, also in the Caribbean. His title will be Emerging Coastal Access Issues in Grenada. Andre Joseph-Witzig is a Grenadian environmental specialist. His BSc is in Life Sciences and Marine Biology from St. George's University in Grenada, and he has a master's in coastal science and policy from the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research has focused on coastal ecosystem services and monitoring beach erosion. He has contributed to climate change and coastal zone management policy and interventions in Grenada, together with international agencies and the Ministry of Environment. He is also a member of a local NGO, Grenada Land Actors, which is challenging destructive coastal megatourism projects which are taking place in some of the most sensitive parts of the country. It is my pleasure to welcome Andre, and who's been a longtime friend and a colleague of mine for many, many years. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello to everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Andre Joseph-Witzig. As Nick just introduced me, I'm from Grenada, and I'm going to touch a bit on coastal access issues in Grenada. And then towards the end, I think more specifically what Grenada Land Actors has been doing on the regarding some of these issues in Grenada. So again, my colleague who just presented was from Jamaica. So I think we're very familiar with the Caribbean and our neighbors. But for anybody who is from abroad, again, Grenada is right to the south of the Eastern Caribbean chain. It's above Trinidad and Tobago. And Grenada is a tri-island state, so Grenada and our smaller islands, sister islands of Carriacou and Petite Martinique. We are a Commonwealth country, again, so we are formerly British, although we were French at one point as well, too. And we became independent in 1974, approximately 133 square miles, a population of a little over 110,000. And our economy is largely tourism-based. We used to be historically agriculture. Agriculture and fisheries still play important but smaller roles now in more recent times. In terms of coastal challenges in Grenada, so again, like many other Eastern Caribbean countries, we have huge problems with coastal erosion. In the bottom left corner there is actually our sister island of Carriacou, where again we have historical cemeteries, which are actually completely in the sea now in some areas. We have challenges with sargassum, challenges with coastal development in general, as well as the planning of coastal development and the type of armoring and coastal engineering that happens on our coast. Again, just in our nearshore waters, we have, again, problems when it comes to the destruction of our coral reefs. Coral bleaching has been a huge problem in the last few years in the Caribbean. So we have actually seen, death of corals, and that, of course, has impacts on our beach in terms of the material of where our beach comes from, but also coastal pollution and coastal algae and also are also major problems, again, sometimes linked to the type of coastal development that we have. And then Grenada has a number of different coastal hazards, hurricanes, storm surge and storm swells, coastal flooding. We do have the risk of tsunamis as well because we have an underwater volcano to the north of the country. And then, of course, sea level rise as well and other aspects of climate change. In terms of the type of coastal zone management policy and legislation we have, for a long time, the only thing Grenada had in terms of legislation was a Beach Protection Act, which dates back to 1979, which is really focused much more on the prevention of beach sand mining, which again was a important, unfortunately, source of sand for development for a very long time. That act was fairly recently repealed with the passage of the 2019 Integrated Coastal Zone Management Act, and you can see the front page of that act over here. And ideally, that act really calls for major shifts in the development of our coast. And a really important aspect is it calls for the development of a coastal zone management plan, which would again provide specific provisions for public access through and to the beach and other natural areas of the coastal zone. Unfortunately, since the act has passed, it is completely unenforced. And in fact, no capacity has even been hired to implement this act. So again, we have an act that doesn't mean it's actually doing anything. So actually, most of the control of development of our coast is under our 2016 Physical Plan Development Control Act. And again, it comes to the mandate, through the mandating environmental and social impact assessments for specifically coastal development, among other types of development as well. So again, besides that act I mentioned, there's very little provision for coastal access in our local legislation. As a Commonwealth country, we're still guided by UK common law. And again, from the laws of England here, the idea that the Crown is more or less the owner of the coastal zone, or the area between the high water mark and the low water mark. Many other Caribbean countries are guided by this as well still. I actually did find we had some recent legislation, so a recent court case, which actually referenced the Coastal Zone Management Act, where there was a dispute regarding the ownership of what we would again presume to be the coastal zone, and again the high water mark, the low water mark. Unfortunately, the court actually found that there was very little evidence put forward by the government in terms of where the high water mark was. And so it actually they did not favor the government when ruling under this case. And I think that sets a very, bad precedent actually in terms of the very fact we don't know where our high water mark is. And in fact, if the government doesn't defend a case properly in terms of putting forward the correct data, then that area can be in dispute, and potentially private developments and things can actually say, hey, we own this. So I think that's a very problematic case actually, and one which I think hopefully we can change going forward. So again, I mentioned some of the different types of coastal access issues we have in Grenada, some of the slow onset issues, which we again associate with more climate change. And then we have more rapid onset issues, I think, which I'll touch on in terms of giving a number of examples and then focusing maybe on some more than others. So again, storms and hurricanes, you see very rapid changes to our coast. Sand mining, again, even though it's been ongoing many years, again, it can drastically change our coast in a much shorter time span versus, for example, long-term sea level rise. More recently, unplanned and ad hoc coastal development, including coastal engineering, is where we're seeing very rapid changes in our coast. And again, oftentimes without proper impact assessments, without community consultation. And then we have actual direct changes to coastal access. So again, destruction of access, destruction of coastal vegetation such as mangroves, destruction of coral reef, and destruction sometimes of the actual physical beach, which I think is becoming hugely problematic now in the last few years. So again, I'm just going to give a couple examples. This is a coastal area in the north of the country in Soteres, where again, this area has been heavily impacted by coastal erosion. Sand mining has been ongoing in this area for multiple years as well. And the town to the bottom right-hand side of the coast there was basically under threat from coastal erosion. Unfortunately, the way forward that they chose here was to develop coastal engineering, and I'm just going to move forward to the current picture. So the last picture was from 2014. This picture is basically showing what it currently looks like. Is to develop coastal engineering without doing the proper studies, without doing an impact assessment. So basically, a huge amount of the coast is actually now being trapped inside of this breakwater, which is basically acting like a groin. And the same area that was heavily affected by erosion now, and where we have very low-income people living, is hugely being eroded now. And in fact, archaeological artifacts are being washed out of the shore directly in that area. Again, in other parts of the coastline, we have massive development happening. Basically, tourism development, where there's a complete disregard to any act, whether it's the Coastal Zone Management Act, whether it's the Physical Planning Act. We have complete destruction of mangrove forests. We have actual destruction of beaches, and cutting off access, community access to smaller beaches. So I'm just going to move forward again. The first picture was from about 2014. This is 2019. This is the current day. And actually about 100 feet of beach has been completely lost here due to coastal engineering, due to building of this small groin-like structure here. The mangrove forest has been completely destroyed. And the small beach to the south here is basically, you have to basically, ask the hotel permission to go there now. Whereas in the past, people used to regularly go from one side of the beach to the other. This is just another angle taken with a drone shot. Again, the destruction of coastal vegetation and mangroves is hugely problematic now. And in fact, again, armoring of the coastline, beach replenishment, so even putting artificial beach sand on our beaches, again, without consultation, without doing proper studies, again, seems to be the law of the day nowadays. Again, we have problems with pollution. So when it comes to wastewater discharge, they're sometimes directly in the back beach area. And in this case here, that discharge actually leads directly onto the beach as well. So we're seeing a huge lack of oversight and enforcement regarding these things. We're seeing direct encroachment on beach areas. So this is the area of beach to the southwest here, where again, the development is directly on the beach, affecting turtle nesting, affecting access, affecting recreation. Using Google Earth satellite imagery, you can see here the before and after, about 2014, again to present day. So this development is again directly where the beach used to be. We're also seeing smaller cases where people are directly fencing their property right down to the beach and affecting access in some ways. Where have people directly developing at the edge of the beach or encroaching on the beach with no buffers or setbacks. Another recent case here, we have a very, very small beach here where a commercial jetty is planned. No environmental impact assessment has been done yet. This jetty will actually encroach on the beach, destroy parts of the beach, will probably require dredging to be done. And the little image to the corner here just shows you that the width of this beach is about 30 feet, 10 meters. So it's a very, very tiny beach to have this type of development happening without any proper oversight. Of course, we unfortunately have hurricane damage happening as well. This is from our sister islands of Carriacou, where we actually, after the hurricane, had, galvanized aluminum, all sorts of materials stuck in the beach, affecting public recreation and safety. Luckily, the majority of this has been cleaned up now. Unfortunately, the mangroves in our sister islands suffered hugely under the hurricane as well. So again, we have the before and after shots here showing almost complete destruction of mangrove areas here, again affecting the integrity of the beach because many times the coastal vegetation is what's holding the beach together. Again, I mentioned we have massive development happening. We have massive development happening in some of our most sensitive areas here, including a Ramsar site. The country's only wetland protected under the Ramsar Treaty. So the mangroves here were heavily damaged after the hurricane, but we also have $1 billion development here, which is encroaching directly on the mangroves and actually the beach as well. The hurricane also directly impacted the beach. This is one of the most important turtle nesting beaches in Grenada, and we would have lost a lot of eggs due to the storm surge that happened during the hurricane. And again, I mentioned encroachment from the development, so clear cutting of land, clear cutting of mangroves, and part of this development includes a huge golf course, which actually would, at one point, the design was showing that being directly on the beach as well. So again, these are tons of problems. I know I'm skipping over a huge amount of them, but what are possible solutions? Again, the idea is we have a lot of legislation, it's not enforced. So again, many of the legislation is not accompanied by regulations, which would actually spell out things like fines or, how different parts of the legislation would actually work once it's implemented. So we need regulations to guide environmental impact assessments, which are basically, the Wild West at the moment. We need regulations to guide the Coastal Zone Management Act, and we need legislation to protect mangroves around the country. Again, we need a coastal zone management plan. Another possible solution could be community-led development, and I'll show an example of this. In many cases, we have areas of coastal access where community has actually created it, even though the land is private. And then other possible solutions would be legal challenges, looking at judicial review, but going to the courts to ask for a review of the decisions of, for example, physical planning. Constitutional challenges, and again, sustained local protests is incredibly important. And I think my colleague from Jamaica was talking about that as well. So again, community initiatives here. These are two examples where, again, private people have set aside areas to act as coastal access. And in fact, I only recently became aware of that. I always took it for granted that these areas were public before, and the government had made these allocations, but that actually was not the case. And I think this will be incredibly important going forward. In terms of legal action, so the NGO that I'm involved with, Grenada Land Actors, actually started a claim, a judicial review claim for 3 massive developments that were happening around the country, 3 massive coastal developments. In many cases, again, it was to do with the integrity of the impact, the environmental and social impact assessments. In some cases, we saw there were massive gaps where the EIAs did not consider the marine environment. They did not consider coastal access. They did not consider the impact of the development on mangroves. They didn't consider the impact of the development on the coastal zone, on coral reefs and things like that as well. So again, we were basically asking for the public register to actually be kept in such a way that the community could engage with the planning approval process. And in fact, that whole process is very secretive, and in things like environmental impact assessments are not easily accessed by community. We wanted regulations to be developed, and we're challenging specific aspects of the different developments. I guess I'm not going to go into everything here, but these are the developments when we sort of started around 2020. And again, as I mentioned, what we are really challenged is with the fact that we found that the EIAs in each case were hugely deficient. And finally, this year, actually, in January, we actually got a partial victory in this case. And this was like 5 years ago. So we started in 2021 in terms of filing the case. And again, certain aspects of the developments have now been quashed. So for example, the approval for the golf course has now been quashed in the Lever Ramsar site. And again, similarly with La Sagessa, aspect of the development has been quashed as well. And we also won in terms of the public register and how the physical plan and development was keeping that. So that is a case which is still ongoing. We have partial success. Actually, we have filed an appeal because there were certain areas where we were not successful, and we still think we have a lot of merit in terms of that. The last thing I wanted to end on is Grenada has a lot of historical examples of protest. I think specifically at La Sagesse, which is the same beach I spoke about. We had a lot of protests around this site around the time of the Grenada Revolution in the 1970s. And again, we saw a lot of community come out and physically protest against this. And this made a huge difference. And I find that this is something we really have to build again, the capacity for that, because in many cases, unfortunately, that has been lost. And that institutional memory needs to be rebuilt again. So thank you very much. I have some references here and the emails for Grenada Land Actors and my email as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Happy to follow up by email. And of course, during the Q&As with any questions anybody has.
Amazing. Andre, thank you for that very wonderful and informative presentation. I will allow questions to drop in the chat. If anyone has any questions for Andre. I think Mike is posing his question again that he might have asked Devin earlier. For ESIAs of coastal developments that do occur, is coastal access one of the factors that must be considered, or is that a discretionary factor? What are the specific triggers for an ESIA of coastal development? Are you able to speak to that?
I think I can try.
Actually, that might have been a question for Andre that for Devin or Andre that got lost in the conversation. Take it if you think it's helpful. Sorry.
Yes, I can see. So in the case of the 3 developments, we reviewed the EIAs for each one, and in many cases, any reference to coastal access was very cursory. And in fact, in some cases, we sort of, it came after the fact. Again, that maybe people started complaining about coastal access or the fact that the development was encroaching on coastal access, that the Planning and Development Authority started coming out and saying, hey, you need to do something about coastal access in this area. But unfortunately, very, very cursory. It doesn't take into account what historical access might have been in these areas. And in some cases, we had allowed access where, again, people have been using that area multiple times for livelihoods or things like that in the past. Those things are not well captured. So in each of these development cases, I think we have a case where specifically the existing access was encroached upon and has been lost. And in the other 2, there's actually physical danger of losing access to the beach. So it's not a strong part of the EIA and it's not mandated, I would say. And that goes to the Coastal Zone Act also not being enforced right now as well.
Thank you for that. And I just wanted to add that Devon's is just responding to Mike's question that coastal EIAs are discretionary in Jamaica. So thank you for answering that. I had a question for you, Andre, and I think I have the insider knowledge here from having grown up in Grenada as well. We grew up with a notion that access to the coast and to beaches was sort of an inherent public right. And I think that story of Lord Brownlow in the 70s was maybe a little bit of something that added to that notion. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to how your understanding of our rights or the rights in Grenada for coastal access has kind of evolved, like how you've come to understand that.
Yeah, I think we do have this notion, and it often gets repeated by politicians, for example, that again, the coast belongs to everyone and no one can own the coast and the access should be maintained. But again, the enforcement implementation is just not there. And again, in the past, growing up here, I would take it for granted that, you can go to any beach. It's only really when you start trying to that you might actually see that it's not so easy to do that. In some cases, it might be a private landowner that owns the access, and they might have put a fence up or something like that. Or in some cases, I've seen that again with massive coastal developments, they are encroaching directly on the beach. Or in some cases, such as the last just development I showed, they have actually blocked access to an existing beach by completely building over the access. And now you have to go and ask permission, to access that area. Um, and again, yeah, I think there's this sort of cultural idea of this, and many other islands. I think they had like a similar, whether it's a king's chain or a queen's chain, or the idea that the coastal zone up to the area between the low water mark and the high water mark belongs to the crown or no the government, and that area will be maintained for public use. But now it seems that, if the government doesn't enforce that, then, a private landowner, a hotel owner or something can encroach on it. And there needs to be either, sustained public protests. And in some cases, there have been protests in Grenada where people have seen machinery damaging the beach and things like that, for example. And that does get the politicians' notice. But then it keeps happening if that protest doesn't happen every time, or if it doesn't happen, then the encroachment happens.
Yeah, certainly you're speaking to many of the challenges that that face sort of the advocacy for coastal access. I think one of the common themes we might have seen from some of the other presentations, but certainly from our own understanding of coastal access issues, is this sort of slow chipping away and erosion of access in places. And I think your presentation speaks to that a little bit. I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate a little bit on maybe how that loss of access is being viewed locally. Is there sort of an appreciation that is happening, or are people, is that sort of kind of going missing or lost in the process? And then are you like afraid that we might wake up one day and have lost a lot of access? I'm just kind of curious what the reception has been from people.
Yeah, I think in many cases it's not widely talked about. Again, I was recently actually in Karaku the last weekend, an area where I don't get to go as often as I would like. And people talk about, for example, that a landowner has bought this area and now the access has changed. And in fact, it might be an access which is much worse than it was before, along the edge of a cliff or something like that. And again, many people might not be able to access areas like that. Or again, you have areas where people there are gates where there were never gates before. And if people don't go and ask or they feel intimidated, then they just go to a different beach or something like that, and that access becomes eroded, like you said. So I think it's happening in small pockets all around the country, but there really is a lack of a movement really needed to change this, to prevent this from happening. And there are potential inroads in terms of the legislation I mentioned, the Coastal Zone Management Act, which calls for a coastal plan, which calls for a coastal plan, which really mandates access around the coast. But again, there needs to be a huge push for that to be developed. And for, again, people to protest that their rights are being lost, basically.
I guess I was trying to think of, as you were talking, it made me think of a little bit about Devin's presentation earlier and some of the routes that they are using to advocate for beach rights and access in Jamaica, and also a notion that we have come to understand, at least here in Nova Scotia, that the courts are a really poor place to litigate these things, because often the outcome is uncertain and there's costs and complexity associated with that. And I know you've been involved in some litigation that you mentioned, not necessarily around access, but I was wondering, in terms of strategies and approaches, whether you see litigation or the courts as a way forward, or is that maybe kind of a last resort, and just how you would contextualize that in terms of potential strategies that might be available for advocating for coastal access.
Yeah, I think the really developing the capacity to access the courts is incredibly important. But again, the courts are very, very slow. And again, something like judicial review is a very narrow process where they're looking specifically at the decisions that the entity has made, the government entity, whether it's the Plan Development Authority or things like that. So it's very limited in certain ways. And in fact, many times in our case, actually, we did speak to beach access as well. And there is a sort of reticence from the courts to tell the government authorities what their job should be. So again, that's why I mentioned things like even taking constitutional approaches as well, because the judicial review is a very narrow approach against a government decision. But it could be that people might have to take constitutional motions against what's happening as well in terms of their rights to access these areas, to their livelihoods, to their recreation, and those sorts of things. It's a very slow process as well. Again, this case actually took 5 years, and actually finally got a judgment now, and we still have to look at appeals and things like that. I think it does raise what's happening to a particular, international community. You can gain support from lots of other legal organizations. We had support from organizations such as ELAW, such as the Global Legal Alliance as well. But again, sometimes you can sort of be a small group advocating, you kind of almost feels like you're shouting, into a void, because again, you're missing the wider community and their ability to protest in terms of what's happening. And sometimes protests can force change in a much shorter period. But again, as I mentioned before, sometimes that if it's not ingrained into legislation or law, then it has to be done over and over again. As governments change, as people forget. So I do think there's a role for both. And I really empowering the community to speak up is incredibly important, and that's not always the easiest thing to do in a court case as well.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much for that, Andre. We're unfortunately out of time in this session. Thank you for your presentation and answering all the questions. Thank you also to Devin Taylor for taking us into the issues that you are facing. I'm sort of a little bit heartbroken, but also I find it interesting that the issues that you have both spoken to in this session are very much, connecting the environmental degradation and the loss of, finite and sort of limited coastal environments in your respective countries, and as you fight sort of these various development and pressures on the coast, and I think that really reminds us that coastal access and coastal protection and coastal zone management are really things that go hand in hand. So I want to thank you both again for your very thoughtful presentations. We will be moving on to our last break.